I want to begin by offering you a picture. I want you to imagine what it's like 3 minutes after the ascension. Suddenly, the Jesus who, according to the story, has been with the disciples since the resurrection, suddenly that Jesus is no longer present. He's been taken out of the story. And 3 minutes after the ascension, the apostles are looking round desperately for him. And all they can see is each other. That's the picture of the ascension that moves me. 3 minutes after the ascension. All they have, and make no mistake, it's enough, though they don't realize it, all they have is each other. And it's the same here this morning. We gather to celebrate the ascension. And as we look around, all we can see is each other. For the apostles and for us, instead of the happy ending sort of celebration, much loved, of the traditional ascension celebration, we have something far more exciting, far more risky, far more tentative. That is the beginning of life in God as a community of faith. That is each other. My mum loved happy endings, and they're very tempting, aren't they? A happy ending for the Christ who suffered and was put to death. But I want to take issue with this theology and consider another way of looking at it. The early church had two ways of telling the story of Jesus. It had lots, but two main ways. The first, the dominant way, comes from the church in Jerusalem. It's the story told by a community and individuals who had a real sense of place. They lived intimately with the places where the story happened: Bethlehem, Calvary, Emmaus, and the mountain of the Ascension. It's the way of telling the story of Christ that fills those pilgrimage that people spend fortunes going on. Here's the rock that Jesus sat on. For the church in Jerusalem, the story is space-specific. It's ordered, linear, tidy, and affirms the happy ending of the ascension. It's a very familiar hero story, a battle with enormous odds. Everything is difficult and painful and looks for a moment like total failure, but don't worry. In the last reel of the film, the hero rides off into the sunset, or in our case, is taken up into a cloud. Contrast this with the way the story was told in Rome in those early days of the life of the church. Here, nothing was linear. Nothing was one thing after another. Everything was held together as one, a complete and whole story in the palm of the storyteller's hand. The birth, life, death, resurrection, and ascension of Jesus, one story, held firmly in the worship of the church, not a sequence of stories that happened one after the other in different places. In this way of telling the story, the birth of Christ and the passion of Christ are the morning and the evening of the same day. The risen Christ is present on the cross, and the crucified Christ is met in the garden of the resurrection. There's no separation between pain and death and resurrection, between the baby who is greeted by the wise men, the man who turns water into wine, who cries out from the cross, my God, why have you forsaken me?" and the Christ who holds out his wounded hands to Thomas, breaks bread at Emmaus, or is taken into heaven at ascension. Christ is birth and passion and resurrection and ascension, all one story. And it has little to do with the Hollywood naivety of the happy ending. but the much richer reality that we know in our own lives, that death and life and pain and passion and joy and sorrow are different sides of the one coin of faith, one coin of our lives. Here is God incarnate. That's what the disciples saw 3 minutes after the ascension. That's what every Eucharist says. As we find each other, all is one. And we can find, I think, one word for this whole story, and that word for me is passion. The passion of the Christ, which we know in our passion, and which is always at the heart of our faith and our living. It's the passion that turns the happy ending on its head. The passion where love, self-giving love, is the only response to hate. Where love in the face of hate does not transform hate, much as we might want it to, but shows us that we must tolerate. We must hold love and hate together in the palm of our hands and tolerate it in fearless living, in truth-telling, and inevitably in persecution and pain and martyrdom and death. I want to think a bit about passion today. And I'm aware that faced with passion, it's easy to become a bit shy, reserved, a bit embarrassed, to look for easy words and trite ideas that won't take us over the top or too deep down, that sidesteps the full demands of the gospel, that sends us home with our sensibilities intact. But that won't do. What does it mean as followers of Christ to be passionate followers of Christ? We know from Christ that it's about life and death being one. Ludwig Wittgenstein, the philosopher, talking about how we make meaning in our talking and in our living, said that ultimately the only thing that has meaning, that has life, is what we're prepared to die for. That's what the story of Jesus is all about. So what does it mean in our living out of our Christian faith to be prepared to die for what we believe? Here, I reckon, is the context of the Passion. Passion in all its varied and rich forms. Passion from the root word, passio, meaning pain and suffering, meaning crucifixion, meaning the orgasmic, ecstatic energy of loving, of abandonment, of sex. Pain, death, and sex have always sat close together and even embraced each other. It's no accident that in the Middle Ages in English, and still to this day in French, the metaphor for orgasm is the little death. So here we have pain, sex, and death, passion's trinity. When we try to hide our pain rather than see it as giving us information about ourselves and our God, we are dumbing down our faith to nothing more than a harmless religious sitcom, an Anglican Coronation Street, that helps us pass a pleasant hour or two on a Sunday morning, but keeps the reality that we tuck out of sight from disturbing us. In keeping sexuality out of sight, when we ignore and repress the glorious sexiness that is part of Christian worship and Christian theology, when we ignore the sexuality that informs us and excites us whenever we get together intimately, closely, and with each other, in doing all this, we are shutting off a vital part of God's incarnation at the very heart of us. After all, we all have sex lives, whether it's in our heads or our beds.